Hello, and welcome to another episode of Zero K, podcast about Urbit, the operating system for the next 500 years. I'm here with my esteemed co-host, Roslet Tanner. We just had a good conversation with our man Tiller-tolbus about all kinds of Urbit things, non-Urbit things, things that are neither of the two, a secret third thing. Roslet, what did you kind of take away from this conversation?
Well, first of all, it was really cool to hear about Gary's sort of like entree into Urbit and sort of how he started working on it, what interested him, and sort of how he views it in general. Um, and also, there's a lot of stuff I didn't know about Red Horizon. So he shared quite a bit that I found really interesting, and I think like most people will too. Those are the highlights for me.
Yeah, so it functions as an intro to both tiller-tolbus and Red Horizon for those of you that are unfamiliar. What was cool for me is I think it was interesting to hear he talks about two of his proposals, one codenamed Aegean and another one just codenamed Chain, which is a an idea for a Urbit L1. It's a layer one blockchain for you newcomers. And so I thought it was really interesting to kind of hear how Gary thinks about that and how such an L1 would add to the Urbit experience and kind of dovetail with all the rest of the stuff that Urbit has got going on. So this is a great conversation. He was a great guest. I think you'll all enjoy this very much. So with that said, why don't we dig in?
Yeah, enjoy.
So, so Gary, like my little interrogation is just basically like, what we always do. Usually we just ask people like, how did you even, like, what's your relationship to Urbit? Where did that come from? Like, what were you doing before? It's just a freewheeling conversation. So feel
Okay.
free to just take it wherever it goes. Is that about right, Anthony?
Yeah, it's perfect. And you could even lie. Just make things up.
We're not going to know.
There's no fact checkers.
No.
Although maybe I should do that. Maybe I should just listen, hang back, Google stuff people say, and just make one of these sounds. Actually,
Confirmed
Noah,
bullshit.
no, it's so fucking loud.
Sorry.
Wow, we just lost a listener. He's like, I don't know, I don't need this shit. What are you doing,
That's
dude?
okay. They don't need to be here.
It's true. They couldn't hang.
Right. So, like, professionally before Urbit, I really wasn't doing anything too interesting, like from a software perspective. I wasn't doing a lot of coding. It was more of it had more to do with, fixing real hardware type things, like technician type roles. Specifically, my last job before getting involved in Urbit was a technician at an access control company working on access control devices like gates, security systems, security cameras, and doing a lot of hands-on technical work and networking troubleshooting. Um, I fell in love with Urbit just like, being enamored with kind of the ideals of the project. I was always interested in programming, just as, at some points in my life, a potential career path, but that never really panned out. And I kind of had trouble with some of the ways that I was taught how to program. And I always wanted to work with code in like this kind of mathematical building blocks kind of way. Was really attracted to functional programming, but I had a very like tangible sense of how impractical it was to build real things with functional programs. And Urbit, I felt like really was a very nice effort to address that kind of impracticality of using functional programming as like the basis of a mature like user facing system.
So am I understanding correctly then that your kind of like first heavy duty programming experience was Hoon then?
I don't know if any of it was really heavy duty. I mean, it might be imposter syndrome. Engineer has never been my job title, even today. I do project
Just like
management at Red
code
Horizon.
guy.
Yeah, code. I think I'm like pretty good at research. I'm pretty good at taking ideas that are like really fuzzy and making them like clear enough to be actionable. And then programming is like the other end of that, where it's clear enough to be actionable, and then you're making it like very discrete, like to the final point of granularity. And I'm okay at that, but I'm like my skill is in the higher end.
Interesting. So kind of like making requirements, generating requirements, that kind of stuff. I think that's probably a underrated skill, certainly, because I think that sometimes people think you could just go straight from real world issues to code, and there's this level of notching down there. So I feel like that's kind of what you're good at, right?
Yeah, that plus research plus being experienced enough in the granular engineering side of things to empathize with engineers and not just kind of give them commands. That's my specialty.
That's an important place on the spectrum. Absolutely. So, in terms of the hardware stuff you were doing, like, how do you feel like that affected, the way you approach, I mean, you alluded to this a little bit, but like concretely, how did that approach what you thought about programming? Because I think you mentioned something about functional stuff. How do you think that directly influenced your thoughts on programming?
Well, before I was working in access control, unrelated to like any jobs I was doing, I was studying this amazing book, The Structure and Interpretation of Computer Programs, which I started reading because I kind of envisioned myself as maybe one day starting a software career. By the time I finished it, it's quite a dense book, quite a long one too.
By Donald Knuth, right?
I don't think so. I think it's written by a pair of people. It's an MIT book.
Oh, okay.
It's usually referred to as like SICP.
Okay.
It's kind of a meme book actually in some circles. There's a lot of people
It's okay,
people refer
Paul,
to
we
it
can,
without.
we can fix that in post.
I'm not allowed to say anything. No, this is where you're supposed to make the toilet sound on me. There we go.
It's one of those books that people will refer to more often than having read.
Okay.
Claim to
There we
have
go.
read if they hadn't read
It works perfectly. Sorry, continue.
But yeah, I really liked the ideas in the book. By the time I finished with it, I was no longer under the illusion it was going to kickstart some kind of programming career. Although it did help me understand Urbit much faster than other newbies. There's a lot of similar concepts that go across, especially the kind of meta-circularity aspects of it, and like the structure of Scheme and Hoon kind of are similar. But in any case, by the time I finished it, it was no longer really a practical gateway to me in any way towards a real career. But I did kind of feel that I had learned something. I kind of like grokked something very deep about the computer, where like nothing was really mystifying to me. Like there's still plenty of components of computing where I'm not exactly clear on how every last component of it works, but there's no part of the computer that I just consider to be magic. I mean, nowadays with LLMs, I think I'm still kind of behind the times. But in terms of at least the components that make normal practical computing work, it all seems fairly tangible to me since finishing that book. So that's kind of, and it also kind of gave me like a very aesthetic appreciation for it. Just the elegance of some of the concepts, or at least the way that some of the concepts can be expressed elegantly. And then on the counter side to that, the way that in practice they're often not.
Yeah, like the gap between the elegant thing in the book and then the raw reality of actually making it into a production system, right?
Yeah, and I think that's like a very common thing among people who like Urbit or specifically Hoon, is like the kinds of complaints that engineers will lobby about Urbit tend to be like very, very picky, where like the same kinds of things, like this, the kind of like minute dangly ugliness that people will complain about in components of Urbit are just like, the complaint is that it's not perfect, that it's not perfectly elegant. And it's just that Urbiters tend to expect this standard of like, no, this has to be as small and diamond perfect as we can get it. And that's just like not even directly a practical goal all the time. The aesthetic goal is kind of underlying the mission.
So do you think that because I, of course, I agree and have experienced this many times. And do you think that that kind of desire for that aesthetic perfection is like more harm than good, or do you think it's a good thing? I mean, because I feel like some people would say, actually it's a distraction and you should worry about making a better ball of mud, basically.
Yeah, that's the received wisdom. And yeah, I mean, that's like the defining thing about Urbit as a project, is that it throws out basically all of the received wisdom. I mean, it sometimes brings the received wisdom back and says, okay, that's fine. But in principle, it's like, no, it's ad fontes, what are the axioms and what do they lead to? Obviously, most people on Urbit would disagree with the received wisdom on the ball of mud. And, I think a comparison to like math and science is somewhat appropriate, although I wouldn't draw a direct analogy. But it's kind of how, pure theory selling in the realm of like, non-Euclidean math, for example, where it was just, straight out of the bong, some of the original ideas there, but it ended up becoming quite useful in physics later on. You just have this, like, when you're actually, like, principally, like, in a principled way, trying to seek, like, elegant truth from first principles, practicalities kind of fall organically out of that in ways that you're really not able to predict beforehand.
That's a really interesting point. Yeah, it's kind of hard to predict ahead of. I mean, no shit, right? It's hard to predict ahead of time what will be useful. I mean, that's the nature of research, right? We don't understand what of this will be useful, and some stuff is a long lead time between being a science experiment and it being useful. And I think that's kind of one of the big things about scheduling work, right? It's like, how do you know what's what's a waste of time and what's not?
Yeah, I think one example of that I think is turned out to really pay dividends, at least for Urbit in terms of the narrative, is the zero knowledge thing, where, like, it turns out that not only is Nock really useful and elegant for producing zero knowledge proofs, but, like, the way that it's elegant and useful goes all the way down to the fact that, like, truth is zero in Nock, which was, like, even considered, I think, at some point to probably be a mistake that's just not worth going back on. Like, even that part of it turned out to be useful in ZK. So, I think that's one example. I could probably think of others, maybe not directly off the top of my head, but I do think that Urbit kind of has this same property.
I barely understand. I know about the 0 and 1 thing. So can you explain that to people who are maybe new, and then explain the relationship to ZKs?
I'm not going to be able to break this down all the way to the level of practicalities, but it has to do with the fact that producing a zero knowledge proof involves, on the math sense, on the math level, making an equation, one side of the equation equal to 0.
Interesting.
Like making sure that 0 is what's on that other side. There's, like, this kind of there's a property that evolves from, like, that algebra that, like, allows you to do this magic trick of, like, producing this succinct proof of, like, this equals that. This computation produces that.
Interesting. And, like, for those people who don't know, who are listening, within the Urbit internals, the number 0 is true, and the number 1 is false. Which I'm assuming, I've always kind of thought that was kind of a allusion to scripts like Bash, things that exit with anything but 0, like anything other than 0 is an error. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was the explanation officially given, but I don't think that's the real reason. At some point it was stated, like, it just feels right. It's just true. That's in one of the old docs. And I think the reason why it does just feel right, but for a different reason than you might expect. I mean, there's definitely, like, I sympathize with the perspective that it feels right that 1 is true and 0 is false. I could see why that kind of lines up.
Yeah.
But in the system of Nock, you're dealing fundamentally with, like, your main data type is the integer, and then it's just, like, how you organize the integers that tell you everything else. And so when you're thinking of an integer, like, what's the base case? It's 0. And so when you're thinking of true or false, what's the base case? I mean, I guess it's a matter of opinion, but
yeah, exactly.
Probably the base case is true.
This is kind of a metaphysical thing, right? It's like, is the base case true or false? That's an interesting question. So I was gonna say, like, the practically your day job right now, though, is working for Red Horizon, correct?
Well,
That's
can
right.
we actually go backwards a little bit more? Because, like, I feel like I didn't get the full story. So, like, when did you start working? Did you say when you actually started working full time on Urbit?
Oh, no. Let's get.
I joined Course 1 as a researcher in, God, it's hard to remember now. I think it was June 2022. That sounds about right. Before that, I was doing grants for the Urbit Foundation. I had this silly little project called Membrane. Some people will remember.
Excel.
Yeah, it was towards Sakya's vision, but we never really even got, like, a quarter of the way there. But yeah, so Brian Crane kind of, I met him at Urbit Week in New York, and then shortly after that, I started working for Course 1 to kind of scope out the prospect of running a hosting outfit. And, I did a pretty good job with that. So eventually, when it became an actual operation, I was set to be the driver who kind of, orchestrated the thing.
So then that gets us to Red Horizon. Can you kind of explain what that is for folks who aren't in the know?
Yeah, so Red Horizon is an Urbit hosting provider. It's a way that you can easily get on Urbit for free right now with nothing but an email. It's also a way that you can produce products on Urbit. So if you're an app developer and you want to get people using your app, you can set up what we call a fleet, which allows you to give us, some information about how to get your app, and we can actually cook up Urbit ships that are predefined in exactly the way you define them in a pretty flexible way. We give a lot of power to engineers to define exactly how they want this to work. And then they can send links to potential users who, upon joining Red Horizon through their links, they will get the exact Urbit experience that they specified. And this is primarily targeted at developers who have the problem of Urbit is mostly social apps. The most useful apps are social anyway. And then when you build a social app, you want to get somebody using them. So to solve that problem, Red Horizon Fleets is the easiest way to do it, because you just, you kind of give us the definition of what you've done, what you want the user to see, and then you get this link that you can share with anybody you want, and then they can use your social app.
That's interesting. So just to be clear, like Tlon's hosting service is very tightly coupled to their specific app, the Tlon social app, and yours is, or Red Horizons is rather more kind of plug and play for other app developers. Is that kind of a good way to put it?
Yeah, it's more laissez-faire. We do have an opinionated default experience for when people just go to redhorizon.com and sign up. And it includes just some things that generally we think people will like about Urbit. It's one of the ways that you can sign up for Urbit, for example, and immediately have access to this rumors feed that everybody's always talking about. We have like this gossip bootstrap node that hooks people right up to. So Beautiful. In a couple of ways, we're trying to just like get people started, connected, but with the general audience coming in through there, we actually don't know a lot about their preferences. So it's kind of hard actually to make something that's tailor cut for them. The Fleets thing is to put that power into people's hands who also want to bring people onto the network for whatever reason, to promote their thing or to promote Urbit in the way that they want to see it, and be more opinionated than us trying to cast a really wide net.
Do you guys approach the actual hosting infrastructure differently, than Tlon's? I'm assuming you do, but
yeah, architecturally it's quite different. I understand Tlon uses like a Google Cloud-based system. I don't know any of the implementation details. Obviously, it's proprietary, but we don't. We have a bare metal system, so we have a kind of orchestrator program that's also proprietary to us that kind of abstracts the concept of an Urbit ship within. It allows you to make assumptions as if you have like this kind of dynamic cloud platform from the maintainer's perspective, while in actuality, we're using like bare metal servers and reducing costs that way. So it's like a very scalable way of doing it. It brings costs down really low. It allows us to potentially, when the time comes, we'll be able to support, hundreds of thousands of users without bearing a significant maintenance burden on at least the cost of the resources. And yeah, I think that's like part of the right way to get up to like true data center scale.
Nice. And do you or do you not get Google Gemini support right out of the box? That's
with the Google Cloud version of it.
You could generate it.
I assume. I don't know. I assume somewhere in the terms and conditions of Google Cloud, it's like we're not gonna like take all the data you feed us and give it to Gemini. But I don't know. You might want to reread that. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Who knows? You get infinite pictures of Asian founding fathers of the United States of America. Okay, so that kind of brings us up to where you are now, and so you've been working on kind of a few different. They're kind of Red Horizon initiatives, but they're more kind of like Urbit Gary's vision type stuff, Tiller's vision, apologize. And so I'm interested to know, so the two things that I'm very familiar with are, you have your ideas about building an L1 on Urbit, and then the other one that I kind of think is worth talking about a little bit more is this thing you call Aegean. So I'm wondering if you can kind of like summarize this and for our listeners here, and explain kind of what that means, like how that's different than how we use Urbit on the user side now.
Yeah, I do. They do kind of relate in my head, but I don't want to answer both questions together. I do think they should be kind of communicated separately. So on the L1 side, the project is currently called SendChain. When I first brought it out, it was called SendToken. So for those of you who don't use the weird Hoon syntax, that just means, you probably would have heard it referred to as token before, and now it's called chain. So, originally it just kind of came out of, there have been efforts to build, or at least talks about building L1s natively on Urbit before using Urbit primitives. I always kind of felt like that was not really, taken as far as it could have gone. And not really, I don't think anybody who's actively programming on Urbit has actually implemented a full stack L1 before. It's a pretty heavy endeavor generally. But myself, especially not having done that, I didn't really feel like it was a scary problem to tackle, and I started researching like how one might attempt to do that. So currently, I would still define it as a research project in a lot of ways. There's definitely unknowns all over the place, but the results of what's been done so far is pretty optimistic, I would say. There are some really nice things that come out of Urbit straight out of the box for building L1 type stuff. Specifically, the identity system, using that as a core primitive, which I don't think any of the previous efforts really tried to do in the way that I'm doing it. In a blockchain, normally, the core identity primitive is the public key. And that's, comes down the pipe from Bitcoin, which is this really radically open system. And like the impressiveness of Bitcoin is how it can be so radically open and so radically secure at the same time. That's the genius of it. So going back to like ignoring the existence of any other chain, just taking like this kind of Byzantine fault tolerance idea and trying to bring that into Urbit, it was really obvious to me, at least, that the identity primitive you want to be working with is the PAT-P, not the public key. And I think it actually is both. I think you do want to respect accounts in the system that are just public keys. It's beside the point. The point is that you really want to, at the deepest layer of the system, use Urbit ID as an identity. And you get some pretty nice things out of that. I mean, you don't get quite the same, at least in like kind of mathematical terms, guarantees about like what the attack model is. For example, in my model of using stars as validators, you could also do the same thing with galaxies as validators. That's like a thing to go into if you want. But just generally by choosing higher level nodes and saying those are the validators, and you need to collude amongst these higher level nodes in order to attack the network, you get some pretty nice security properties out of that, even if it doesn't go all the way to some of the statements you can make about proof of stake or proof of work. It's still quite nice, and it's a lot more elegant. So that's one of the things. I also think it's underrated how useful it's going to be if there's like a financial system that evolves from this, having an Urbit ID as a native blockchain account, meaning like, if I want to pay money to Poldek Tonteg, I'm not giving tokens to an address that Poldek Tonteg is like handing me as the result of some sort of handshake. I'm actually giving money to this account that's called Poldek Tonteg. I think that's also going to turn out to be quite useful. So from like the user perspective of Urbit ID as a blockchain account, and from the validator perspective, just kind of wrapping around the whole Sybil resistance question by saying that higher level Urbit nodes are validators, you end up with a very kind of elegant model of securing the network too.
Very nice. Very nice. And then, so we should talk about that definitely in depth at a later time, but I'm interested to hear kind of how that dovetails with the Aegean stuff, because I think that's kind of almost more open and maybe more consequential for end users in terms of how it would change how people use Urbit. So I'm interested to know more about that.
I really don't want to try to tie the two together. I feel like that's more of like a bong rip kind of way of explaining it.
Okay, well, put the bong down and just...
Yeah, we could try to tie it later after I kind of like make the basic introduction. I really do think they're like very distinguishable projects in principle. So Aegean kind of comes from this perspective of, I mean, number one, I'm just not super happy with the state of the application ecosystem right now. I've always felt since joining Urbit that it was like the bedrock of a very cool social media experience that I thought like OS1 and early landscape was like an homage towards, and that the direction going forward was going to be a lot more like what I wrote in my blog. So, I kind of, I just decided that the best way to address that tension in my head was to, sit down on a weekend and write a bunch of vaporware. So I described a program that doesn't exist, and I still haven't written a single line of code on it.
Nice. Classic technique.
Classic technique. But I got a lot of people excited about this idea that, this kind of thing could exist, that this is actually a really nice way of communicating this thing called Urbit. And I think there's a lot of ways of trying to like specify it. I think people should just read the post if they haven't, because I think I was pretty careful with my wording there. But what informs it is kind of this idea that people who get really into Urbit are really into Urbit because of what it is. We really don't have like a great user profile of somebody who's using Urbit all the time because of like the way that it's expressed to the user. Nobody's like, oh, I love, Talon's instant messaging experience. I'm going to use Urbit all the time. We haven't really gotten to that class of user yet. We have all kinds of users, technical and non-technical, who understand something about what Urbit is under the hood, and they love it. So there's aspects to that I was trying to communicate. I think the core ones are, there's two core ones. One is that, okay, so Urbit is fundamentally a namespace. That's like if you're going to say anything about capital U Urbit, the shortest possible sentence that describes what it is probably something like, Urbit is a mapping from path to data. So exposing that, there's lots of ideas about how to explore a tree in a UI. I think a browser is a really appropriate one. And then, the idea that you have like a bar that you can type a path into, it takes you to a page, is a really powerful one.
But
the second idea.
Let me just back up to make sure we're not losing anyone here. So a namespace, kind of, can you like elaborate what that means for people who might not have heard that terminology before, and give examples from like, the world around them?
I don't know how, you might have to help me with that. I can't think of a real world like corollary to a namespace.
I mean, the way that
it's like a database in a way.
The way I think about it, right, is that, a URL is imagine everyone's familiar with URLs, I'm assuming. They made it here. So especially the URL in a browser, URL is a path, right? A URL actually, we all have experienced, is mutable, right? So you can go to the same URL twice and it'll have different junk at it, or it'll have gone offline. It's a very common experience, but that's actually not how a URL was designed to work, or actually a URI, a Uniform Resource Identifier. And so the idea was always that you would have this path that would lead to a piece of data, probably the best way to think about it, right? And on the open internet, and everyone, make sure to raise your hand if I'm blowing this anyone, but like on the internet that we're familiar with, the quote unquote clear web, that URL system has kind of been broken just by the fact that anyone can do whatever they want because they all run different machines, right? And then the other thing that's broken about it is that the namespace, or the amount of root addresses, like a domain, right, like x.com, is functionally infinite, right? So there will always be more and more, so that the paths themselves can change and the amount of paths is infinite. Which has, some benefits and some drawbacks. And so what's different about Urbit is that you could imagine that, one, those paths are immutable or referentially transparent, at least, meaning that you go to a path and you get the same thing every time. And then the second thing is that that's a fixed number of paths, right? There's, I don't know, however many 4 billion number of paths, of root paths. And so that constrains everything quite a bit. And so what's interesting about Urbit is that there would be no distinction between, let's say, the URL that you would use to visit the website and then the file system, right? The directory path within your machine. That would just be one, I guess, namespace. So that's kind of what a short version of what a namespace is. And Urbit is a very specific kind of vision of that we think is more better, obviously. We wouldn't be doing it if we didn't think it was better.
Yeah, I was gonna. You're making me think like, okay, maybe the namespace example for like the average person is the file system, but actually, like the file system is not really part of the everyday user experience.
Now it's kind of gone away. Yeah, some of us old motherfuckers there's a path, but
the namespace is being taken away from users.
That's really true. Honestly, it's actually a really interesting phenomenon, right? That like, unless you use a command line, if you use any kind of Mac or any operating system, GUI nowadays, like it's sort of gone away, and search has kind of like supplanted it somewhat, which is interesting. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the URL is, people kind of understand URLs still, I think.
Yeah, and so that was one thing, is like, okay, so, this is probably the right way to express, that part of what's under the hood. Again, it's like a show not tell version of this thing that people do like about Urbit pretty universally once they're getting into it. And especially the part of it where like a part of that namespace is yours, it still kind of holds that like that narrative that's always been persistent in like Urbit type products of like, this unit of the Urbit network is your personal thing. So that part is I think necessary to express in a show not tell way. I think that the browser type interface is the way to do it. And then the other thing is the fact that it's just explicitly a social network. And I think this is just like, this is something that I, frequently butt heads with people about. I think it's just so obvious. I think I'm just right. I think everybody who's challenged me on this has not made a good point. That's what Urbit actually is. It's a social network. And like Talon software specifically is definitely social networking software. Nobody's going to deny that. They don't call it social networking software, but they should. But generally, like everything that Urbit is actually really good at, not what it can do, but everything it's really good at so far, all the proven use cases are social use cases. And when people talk about the advantages of Urbit, they always start with the identity system.
Yeah, it's
which
true.
is a personal identity. It's an identity for a social network. Like what's the key advantage to developing on any social network? It's the identity. It's the fact that you know something about the user, that it integrates with other things they're doing.
So can
those are the 2 points.
So can you so just to recap, the 2 points are like you have the namespace, which we think is basically the main draw of Urbit for both people who are technical and mostly people that are familiar with the system. So how about we foreground that in a browser, right, where I can basically cruise around the namespace and see different people, different files that they've shared, pieces of data that they've shared. And then the second thing is to lean into the fact that it is a social network and find some way to basically make a social network browser, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that any large social network is something that you can browse. It's just usually not expressed to you as like a path to page kind of relationship. You are kind of expected to click around and browse things, and people's profiles do have addresses. You even have like often the concept of like something nested within somebody's profile. So now you have like really building out the tree that defines the namespace. So the beginnings of that are kind of already there. It's just not expressed in this browser language. I think the browser language is more appropriate to Urbit because you are actually speaking a protocol and you are actually retrieving something remote from a different source based on different addresses. Yeah. So I think it just makes more intuitive sense. But just to point out that like there isn't really like a lot of friction between the idea of a browser and a social network. Not only can you think of the internet if it was taken for its original purpose as something that anybody can publish content on, like that makes it in some ways a social network. Then you take existing social networks and they are things that you browse and where things are stored at discrete addresses. So I don't think these two concepts have a lot of friction with one another.
That's interesting. I hadn't really thought about that, but like there's this implicit sort of tree structure. Let's just use Twitter because we're on Twitter, right? Like there is kind of the root node would be my profile. And then under that, there would be my posts, and there would also be, other things. But I mean, in Twitter, it's more pretty much just posts, right? And those are just different nodes under the tree, in the tree under my identity, right? So theoretically, you could just sort of, you could arrange that in a kind of like directory-looking system if you felt that you wanted to do so. I mean, most things kind of obscure that in some way. But
and Twitter could make that as flexible as they wanted for you UI wise. It would just always be centralized. Which I think some people would actually like that. I think people were thinking about during the whole net neutrality thing, the idea that Facebook or some big company was going to do that, and like the internet would just consist of the tech giants. And so like, what are businesses going to do to publish their their advertisements on this internet that's just Facebook? Well, they're just going to make Facebook pages, right? Yeah, and that actually would work. That's not the problem with doing that. Businesses would still be able to succeed.
So running it back a little bit, you said, people were mad about this idea about, Urbit is not a social network. Can you kind of like steelman their argument a little bit? What is the counter argument,
Well, I think if I could steelman it, then I would have told you that I thought people had made good points.
Let me try it.
Okay.
Rosla, you could jump in.
Before you do, I want to say one thing, which is like I know that Urbit itself is not a social network. Like that is not what the program Urbit does or was intended to do. What I'm saying is the user experience of using Urbit today is entirely focused around social networking or use cases that are just not that popular.
Yeah. I'm going to give you kind of a weak argument, but I think the one that a lot of people make, which is that, basically social media has come to mean both like the technical part and the kind of incentive social or whatever part of it, if that makes sense. Like, and it's hard for people to draw that distinction because they when you say, oh, Urbit can be Facebook, it's like, well, people are like, well, I don't like Facebook, so it can't be, right? It was just shoddy. I agree. It's not great reasoning, but I think there is something to that, right? That's the argument. And I think probably your position would be like, okay, well, the incentives that make Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, whatever you don't like, are mostly have to do with centralized control of that social network and not the social network model in itself, right? And so
Right.
if we have a decentralized one, then, poof, we say, right? All those incentives go away, and then you're living in a different world. So am I kind of doing the argument correctly there?
I mean, it sounds like you're making my argument.
No, I'm just trying to think about the opponents, like what do people, I mean, obviously people who like Urbit, they have this kind of contrarian, some might even say kind of like pejorative idea, certainly of social media. It's like a prejudice that exists,
Yeah, but like if your opinion of social media is pejorative, then like I don't think I'm capable of talking to those kinds of people unless they get into my house somehow, Like you're obviously using computers to connect. And like I don't know, I mean, let he who doesn't have a profile with a company that he hates cast the first stone.
Very, very true. Absolutely.
Well, I mean, it goes back to this, like, this affliction we see regularly, which is like you can never be pure enough. Like there's just, for certain people, like you just can never achieve the sort of like level of purity that they're looking for. And I think like it's pretty clear that you're just pointing out fact.
Well, yeah, it's like Urbit is a clean slate operating system for purity spiraling, and
Yeah, I mean, there was this narrative, like, about this composability thing, and it had to do with like Urbit and crypto, which obviously never really got proven out. And there's still people trying, including myself. I do think that composability on Urbit is real, and it could be made realer, and crypto is a part of that. There's plenty more to say on that. But when you talk about composability, it's important to say composability with what, right?
yeah.
So, I agree. Urbit is like this kind of ideal in many ways composability machine, and all the ways that Urbit is bad are, ways that it could compose better, honestly. Like that, those are the most serious critiques levied at Urbit are just like, okay, well, I want to compose in this way, and why aren't you letting me? In any case, so like, what are the components that you're trying to compose? And I would say, if I were to tell like stories about, things that I want to be able to do with a computer that I can't, as I elaborate more, I think you could kind of picture this narrative as like a hub and spoke, where the hub is the social media experience and the spokes are all the different things you could do with like finance and AI and what have you. But the connections you make are obviously the point. That's why you're using this kind of networked thing. The identities represented by the counterparties and the kind of topologies of those relationships, that's at the core. And then, there's other things that you do want to compose with that. You want to automate, certain aspects of life, but those are just, they're not the undergirding principle. The principle is the social network. And particularly what that means is like, as opposed to the network in terms of peers that are connected to each other, we're talking about peers that are vouching for each other in some way, right? Like right now, it's the PALS network is, the primary undergirding thing for a lot of different ways that, automatic things happen over the network. And, this is more than who your peers are. This is the peers that you like. These are the peers that you want to do things with. So that's always going to be the base layer. There are probably other ways of describing it, but I would just say this is your social network that's overlaid on top of your physical network.
That's a good point. So for people that are new to this, like PALS is a protocol / primitive that many programs on Urbit use to essentially as the source of truth for friends or for people that you've both said you're connected to. So you can basically say, you can try to connect with someone else, like, will you be my pal? And they accept. And then you have basically a mutual follow. And that's kind of like actually the best single example of composability on Urbit, I think right now, is the fact that you have many, many applications that rely on that, right? But I think that's the most composability we have, I think. It could be more, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, composability is kind of necessarily directional, right? Like who calls who. And so PALS really took off as like this very suitable target for composability because it is quite well maintained, easy to maintain. It's a very simple program. It exposes all the right APIs. And so developers can feel quite comfortable calling PALS. There should and probably will be a lot more of those kinds of things. But the one that is most necessary is like this thing to compose with. because that's always got to be part of the composability idea
Yeah.
is what are you composing with, and it's always directional. There's always a caller and a callee. The callee that forms the hub of these composability fragments that create user stories is going to be the social network.
That totally makes sense. One thing when when we're talking about social media, what's interesting about social media up till now is that these networks form around a specific type of user generated content, right? Written in terms of Twitter, images in terms of Instagram, et cetera. And then you always have the turf battle between different, so Twitter adds video, right? Or sorry, and Instagram adds video and blah, 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 back and forth. And so you end up having this kind of attempt to usurp other people's places. But what would be interesting, and this is, I think, a concrete UX benefit of something like Urbit, is that it would be agnostic in theory, right? You could have a social network whose content type is completely undefined. Well, not completely undefined, but it's not limited to anything. So it could be images, it could be pictures, it could be long form, it could be short form text, it could be video, could be programs, could be spreadsheets, it could be any of this stuff. And that's something that, the world really hasn't seen yet. I think that's kind of where this sort of Aegean thing could go, right? Because you could browse for any of those things.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue we actually do kind of have that in some ways. The web does tell a big part of that story. It really lacks like a user-friendly way. Like, okay, if only hosting a WordPress site and hosting a blog that way was, just as user-friendly an experience as just joining Substack, right? Or something like that. And if only that, like, making that WordPress site, like, also gave you like a broadcast tower from which to tweet. These are the kinds of things that, Urbit is useful for, towards like making the super app, where, you're unifying all of the primitives. That's like a buzz sentence of sorts,
Yes.
But it's kind of appropriate here, right? Like if you have, if you have all these primitives, they're kind of concrete, they're trusted by, a majority of developers to use as the callee in their kind of composability designs, then you can use that as a basis for a kind of super app. And that is what people actually want. People don't like context switching. People don't like open a new tab, open a new window to do something. They want click a button on the sidebar. They want swipe up.
Yeah. That's a good point, though, also, that like really what I'm describing is what the internet was supposed to be, right? And so it's interesting to say, you kind of do have the ability to do all that stuff. It's just that it's like something about the user experience was so stymieing to that it just didn't happen, or doesn't happen. Yeah. I think that a lot of that was probably just literally came down to the identity.
Yeah, it is a huge part of it. It's like hard to overstate.
And that's really the thing that on Urbit, so it kind of comes back to the identity as being the kind of main thing, Yeah,
it's kind of funny that some people are like bullish on Urbit but bearish on Urbit ID. I've heard that a couple times. It's kind of crazy because like
it's the opposite.
Without the ID, like try to rip Urbit ID out of Urbit and see how far you get. Show me what you make.
Exactly.
You reminded me of something. A thought experiment would be like, okay, actually say that the internet is a social network. Just like make that false statement. And then like analyze the internet as such. I think you could actually make a pretty compelling case to yourself if you try this at home, that the internet is just a really bad social network.
Oh, I think that's obviously true, right? And I think it's kind of interesting because it comes down to the fact that there's like no profile page, right? It's like right? I mean, that's really what it comes down to.
Well, they try. There's the website, right? There's the homepage.
Yeah, and that's kind of so it's interesting to think that these relatively small problems or feature gaps ballooned into these huge things that now make it functionally impossible, right? So like just weird stuff. It's you get into this place where you're like, all these things about Urbit there's this back and forth about how much can be kind of unbundled of the Urbit ideas, right? Which ones can be taken and which ones can be left. And it's funny because you just keep coming back to like, a lot more of them are bound up than you think. Like, so for example, the NAT traversal, like the ability to run your Urbit on your home network, right? Which seems like kind of a weird, like, just why, it adds a lot of technical complexity. But just even that thing, it's kind of prevented the original internet from becoming a social network, right? Because like, if no one can get to your computer, then they can't see any of your shit, right? And so you kind of like, that was actually a very important part of the design. It makes you appreciate it a little bit. All right, so I have a question though. In your opinion, then, like, and you could just do a small version of this, how would you bring the sort of chain stuff back into this conversation? In terms of now that we have the sort of Aegean namespace browser idea, like, what's the relationship in your mind to an L1?
Well, it's like what happens when you type in an address that doesn't begin with an Urbit ID? I think that's the question. And I feel like there's this kind of unclaimed land that's actually like this complement to Urbit ID. It's like the other 30% of Zuko's triangle. It kind of requires a blockchain to be able to talk about what's on there. But you are going to end up wanting like fully human readable names as addresses as well. Probably you want some kind of public ownership of those addresses. You're kind of really starting to talk about like this, blockchain type concept when you want to make something like that. And actually, like Uqbar's old Hoon code base kind of has a pretty mature idea of how you would do something like that. And a fair amount of it is, composable and copy pastable. So it's not, out of the question to rip that out and include that as part of the eventual Aegean package. It's like, not only do you have Urbit ID, but you also have real DNS,
So just to be clear, like when you say type in an address that isn't a PAT-P, you mean you're referring to data that would be held in the global state of the blockchain, basically, of the L1.
Right, yeah. I mean, I think in any case, like, this is just a kind of necessary complement to Urbit that will happen. I'm pretty sure Zorp is going to also build this. I'm pretty sure. Because I think he was working at Uqbar, Logan was, when, I think he probably was the one who had that idea to have this, like, public Scry namespace as a complement to the private one. So there's no way he forgot about that. So Zorp is probably going to try to build something like that too. I think this other company, Archetype, which isn't quite as like loud on Twitter, but they do, they are working on stuff. They also have this idea of like this kind of global key value store that people on Urbit are going to want. They're focused on this kind of non-social use case of the software supply chain, but it's very analogous. My opinion is that you probably do want like a truly Urbit native, like blockchain as application, to be the fountainhead of this kind of extra harmonious namespace. And so I think in the end, if there's like a set of different namespaces that are competing to be like the one true one, I would hope that there's a pretty good argument that the one on SendChain is the best for various reasons.
That's interesting. Yeah. So I think that would be that idea that, I mean, I do think you're right that a lot of people are kind of pushing in this direction. And I'm sure there are kind of like varying arguments you will make about should it be even on Urbit or should it be on Cosmos or be on something else, right? And I think that's sort of just everyone's got their own opinion and is building stuff to that. But I think that need to have that global part of the namespace is, I think, acknowledged. I think you're right on that.
I have a question, like sort of just like is there anything that like keeps you up at night that like bothers you or that you wish that was part of the kind of Urbit universe discussion that people aren't talking about? Or is like, do you generally feel like really positive about everything? I'm just curious, like, what do people feel and think? Like, what keeps you up at night about this, if anything?
I mean, the fact that I've been blogging about it, which is not a normal activity for me, I think shows that,
level of...
Yeah, it shows a level of care. I wrote 2 blog posts that I tweeted. Actually, probably in my life, I think there are 2. And one of them is about the tokenomics of SendChain, and then the other one is about Aegean. So these are just ideas that I think are very kind of misunderstood or underappreciated, underexpressed, underheard. The tokenomics thing, I don't know. That's like that's a different thing entirely, but it is kind of, at least my opinion on the Urbit address space, how it kind of comes back to life in the market. We haven't really even begun to get into that. But that and Aegean, like the collection of ideas that I kind of directed at there, I think that basically summarizes it.
So if people want to understand more, they can go read what you've written. And also, do you want to share about your podcast?
Sure, yeah. The Red Horizon podcast is just, one part of the hosting operation of Red Horizon. I think we link to it on our website. I'm actually not sure what our homepage quite is. Maybe I should send you, I think the YouTube version of it is like the one that we most commonly link to. And yeah, we have 4 episodes live. 2 of them are in the oven. So soon to be 6.
Beautiful. Tiller, this has been great. It's really great to hear you're thinking about this stuff. It's also great that, you're not just laying away at night instantly, you're blogging, it's good.
You're blogging.
I'm doing something.
I don't worry. I blog. That's I like,
T-shirt.
but I like
Yeah.
the reluctant blogger. That's a really good. More people should do that.
We've been forced to blog.
What
You
is
guys
it?
made me do this.
No choice but to blog.
Born to Hoon, forced to blog. Maybe that's the license plate.
That's really good.
All right, Tiller, this has been great. Thank you so much for spending some time with us. And then for everybody here who may be in Austin or is on their way to Austin, we're solidifying some Urbit events at South by Southwest, probably on the 10th of March. So we'll have more information on that coming up, but it'd be great to see everybody and anyone who is going to be there. All right. That's
Thank you,
it.
guys.
Great talking. Talk soon.
Thanks for
See you
coming.
later.